Snow drifted in slow, whispering spirals across the valley as evening settled its blue hush over the world, and Colt Warringer, age 30, rode through it with the quiet solemnity of a man who had grown used to speaking more with the wind than with people, his breath curling like smoke while his thoughts curled deeper still, because nights like this reminded him how loneliness presses on a man harder than the cold ever could, making the silence feel almost personal as he guided his horse toward the cabin that waited for him like a memory he hadn't yet lived, and with every hoof-step he wondered if anyone in the world still remembered him at all, though he tried not to, yet the ache lingered anyway like frost clinging to glass as he neared the lonely doorway with the same tired hope he carried every winter, unaware that tonight, the snow wasn't the only thing approaching in the dark. He swung down from his saddle, boots crunching against the pale crust of ice, when suddenly a faint tapping reached him. Odd, soft, rhythmic, like someone afraid to be heard but needing to be, and his brow tightened with a mixture of caution and curiosity as he stepped forward, each footstep slow because life had taught him that unexpected sounds in winter seldom meant anything gentle. Yet something in that quiet knock felt more fragile than threatening, so he reached for the door handle with breath held tight in his chest and opened it just as a gust of wind lifted the lantern's flame, revealing a slim figure trembling beneath a torn blanket, and the moment he met her eyes, he felt the world shift like snow slipping from a weighted branch as she whispered, "May I stay one night in your cabin?" The woman stood shivering in the doorway, snow melting on her dark hair like scattered pearls, and when she lifted her chin he saw she was young. Far too young to be wandering alone in this cold, and as she stepped into the thin glow of the lantern, he recognized the raw exhaustion etched into her features, and she introduced herself with a voice as soft as winter smoke. Ayanna Snowbird, age 20, her words trembling not from fear alone but from everything she had already endured before. Reaching this doorstep, and Colt felt something old and protective stir inside him even as he wondered what burden had placed her out here in the storm, though he held the question back, because some pain needs silence more than answers. He motioned her inside, offering the fire's warmth with a careful distance so she wouldn't feel cornered, and Ayanna's gaze flickered around the cabin with the wary look of someone expecting judgment to appear in every shadow, yet she accepted the mug of warm broth he handed her with steadying fingers, each movement delicate and precise as though life had taught her to hesitate before taking anything meant for comfort, making Colt's chest tighten with an unexpected ache that surprised him with its force because he hadn't felt protective of another soul in years, and that sensation unsettled him even more than the storm outside. She sat by the fire with her blanket wrapped close, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, the silence stretching between them not awkward but tender, almost sacred, like they were both waiting for the cold inside their hearts to thaw enough to speak, and finally Ayanna glanced into the flames and murmured that she wasn't running from trouble so much as running from people, the kind who whispered more than they prayed, the kind who feared what they didn't understand, and as she spoke her voice cracked with humiliation she tried to hide, making Colt lean forward without realizing he had moved at all as curiosity bloomed slowly inside him like the first spark of warmth in a long frozen hearth. When she finally looked at him, her eyes held a question heavy enough to bend steel. "Should I leave by morning?" And those words hit him harder than any winter storm ever had, because he recognized the tone, that fragile mixture of dignity and despair, and it echoed an old memory in him of being told he was too quiet, too strange, too much trouble, and he couldn't bear seeing those same shadows in her expression, so he shook his head with a gentle firmness that surprised even himself, telling her that the storm was too cruel, the night too deep, and no soul deserved to walk through either alone, a statement that made Ayanna's breath catch softly as though she wasn't used to kindness offered without condition. The next morning dawned in shades of silver and pale gold, but the storm hadn't fully passed, and Ayanna moved about the cabin with quiet grace, tidying small things, mending a button on his coat, and preparing herbs she pulled from a leather pouch at her waist, each gesture carrying the weight of someone who had learned to repay any mercy instantly to avoid the shame of being seen as a burden, and Colt found himself watching her more than he meant to, noticing how her fingers trembled only when she thought he wasn't looking, creating in him a stirring blend of admiration and worry that deepened every time their eyes accidentally met with the soft surprise of two people unaccustomed to being truly seen. Later, when the sky darkened again and Ayana stepped outside to gather firewood, Colt glanced through the window just in time to see her sway in the deep snow before collapsing silently into its white hush, and the sight jolted through him like a spark finding dry tinder, driving him into the storm before thought had time to form, his arms wrapping around her small frame as he lifted her with urgency he didn't question, her skin cold as river ice beneath his touch, and the fear that shot through him in that instant was so sharp it nearly stole his breath as he carried her back to the firelight. She drifted between fevered dreams and whispered breaths as he tended to her, and in those quiet hours Colt spoke softly to keep her anchored, telling her stories of horses he had tamed and trails he had ridden, hoping the sound of another human voice would pull her back from whatever shadows she wandered, and there was a moment where Ayana's fingers curled around his hand with unconscious trust, a gesture so small yet so powerful that it tightened something deep inside him, making him realize how long it had been since someone had reached for him without fear or hesitation, and that realization haunted him gently as the night passed. When dawn finally arrived, Ayana opened her eyes with a faint gasp, whispering his name, Colt, in a tone so fragile it felt like the world was holding its breath with him, and something inside him softened further, as though her voice had touched a place he rarely allowed anyone near, stirring a warmth that spread through him despite the cold lingering around the edges of the room, and for the first time since she had arrived, there was a glimmer of trust in her eyes that made his heart beat a little slower, a little deeper, a little more hopeful than before. She recovered slowly, but once she was strong enough they rode to town for supplies, moving through streets layered in frost and silence, though the townsfolk's eyes were anything but silent as they trailed after Ayana with wary suspicion that dug into her shoulders like cold iron, and Colt noticed the way she shrank slightly under those stares, her posture tightening with defensive grace, making him shift closer to her without thinking, creating a protective barrier of presence that said more than any words could, and the more he shielded her, the more their connection seemed to weave itself between them like threads of unseen warmth. Sheriff Marlon Hayes approached them near the stables with a measured gait, his expression lined with concern that struck Colt as half genuine, half fearful, and he asked whether Colt knew who he was sheltering, as though Ayana were some wild creature rather than a young woman who had endured too much, and Colt felt his jaw tighten as he listened, Ayana silently bracing beside him as the sheriff explained the rumors, superstition, accidents, blame placed on her simply because she was different, because fear needs a target, and Colt felt anger rise in him, not loud but deep, like heat building beneath stone. When the sheriff was finished, Colt stood straighter, placing himself subtly in front of Ayana, and he spoke with a steadiness that seemed to surprise everyone, including Ayana herself, telling the sheriff that she was under his protection, that she belonged with him, and the words left his mouth before he could question why he had phrased it that way, but the moment they hung in the air, he knew he couldn't take them back, nor did he want to, and Ayana's breath quivered beside him as though the sentence had shifted something fundamental inside her that she wasn't prepared to face quite yet. Back at the cabin, that tension broke as Ayana let years of swallowed emotions spill all at once, her voice trembling as she confessed the shame, the exile, the hollow loneliness of being treated as something less than human, and Colt listened with a patience carved from the quiet places in his own heart, wishing he could undo every wound the world had etched into her spirit, yet knowing that some hurts don't fade with promises but with presence, so he stayed, offering the warmth of his silence and his steady gaze until her breath softened and she leaned toward him with a trust that felt both fragile and fierce. As days passed, they settled into a rhythm that felt strangely natural, each small gesture weaving a deeper bond between them, Ayana brushing snow from his shoulders after chores, Colt placing an extra log on the fire when she shivered, their hands touching briefly when passing mugs or tools, every tiny contact sparking something tender and unspoken in the space between them, and with each evening shared by firelight, their loneliness thinned like ice under early spring light, thawing into something warmer than either dared name aloud. One night, under the soft glow of lantern light, Colt revealed a carving he had kept hidden for days, a figurine he had shaped from pine wood of a woman cloaked in winter wind, her hair flowing behind her like a trail of smoke. And when he placed it in Iana's hands, her breath caught, tears gathering with the kind of emotion that runs too deep for easy words, and she touched the carved figure with trembling reverence, looking at Colt as though seeing him anew through the fragile lens of hope that had long remained closed in her life. Colt spoke softly then, with a tone shaped more by feeling than by language, asking her to stay not just for another night but for all the nights to come, offering her a place beside him for every winter, every sunrise, every weight they could lift together. And though the words weren't dressed as a formal proposal, their intention was stronger than any ring of gold, and Iana nodded with a trembling smile, accepting in silence because her heart was too full to speak without breaking open. Entirely. Their marriage was simple yet sacred, held in Pastor Trenton's small chapel with snow falling like drifting blessings through cracks in the old wooden roof, the candles flickering in gentle halos around them as Colt placed a modest ring, one he had saved for months, though he never imagined who it would be for, onto Iana's finger, and their vows were spoken softly, shaped more by sincerity than ceremony, sealing two wandering souls into something whole as they stood hand in hand while winter whispered around them. A storm trapped them at the chapel that night, but instead of fear, there was a strange serenity in being held inside a place warmed by flickering light and new beginnings, and when a baby's cry echoed from the far corner where travelers huddled for shelter, Iana rushed forward with her herbs and calm strength, tending to the infant with a tenderness that softened the rigid faces of the very people who once whispered against her, turning suspicion into gratitude as they witnessed the quiet power of her compassion. By morning, the storm had lifted, leaving behind pale gold light that streamed through the chapel windows like a benediction, and as Colt and Iana stepped outside as husband and wife, the townsfolk nodded at them not with wary judgment but with a newfound respect carved from truth revealed by the long night's trials, marking a shift that felt like the first true thaw of winter in their lives. They returned to the cabin beneath a sky washed clean by snowfall, their hands linked, their steps unhurried, and that simple walk felt like the beginning of something vast and tender, where the world finally seemed capable of holding the two of them without demanding they shrink or apologize for the space they deserved to claim. And when they entered their home, the air felt alive in a way it never had before, warm with the presence of two hearts learning to beat in rhythm. And on that quiet Christmas night, as firelight painted soft amber across Iana's face and Colt watched her with the stunned gratitude of a man who had finally found the soul meant to walk beside him, the world felt wide and gentle, as though every hardship had been a winding, snow-covered path leading them right here, and Colt knew, deep down, steady as the mountains, that his lonely winters were over, even as a sliver of curiosity lingered in him about what new life might unfold from this fragile, beautiful beginning. He looked out the frosted window once more before sleep claimed him, watching snow drift like feathers from a sky that had finally softened, and though peace settled around him like a warm quilt, he couldn't help but wonder what future storms or blessings might one day knock upon their door, because life has a way of returning echoes when you least expect them, and he felt certain that whatever came next, they would face it together, hand in hand, heart to heart, forever waiting for the next quiet miracle hidden in the winter wind.